This is a presentation on the Black Lives Matter movement by Matthew Quist from Ashford University, Social Psychology, Psychology 610, instructor Dr. Stephanie Anderson. Let's begin with an introduction of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement began as a result of a number of controversial deaths of African American individuals, usually at the hands of the police. The first death was the death of Trayvon Martin on February 26, 2012 in Sanford, Florida. Martin was killed by a block watch captain named George Zimmerman in a physical altercation where he was shot and killed. Zimmerman was charged with homicide, at which time he was acquitted, causing substantial outrage. The next death was the death of Philando Castile on July 6, 2016 in St. Anthony, Minnesota. Castile was shot during a traffic stop. Castile was the driver while his wife or girlfriend was the passenger. Castile advised the officer that he was armed. The officer advised him not to move. It appeared that Castile made an accidental movement, at which time the officer shot and killed him. The officer was charged with homicide but was acquitted of the charges at trial. The next incident was the death of Eric Garner on July 17, 2014 in New York, New York. The NYPD stopped Garner for selling cigarettes illegally. Garner appeared to suffer from exacerbating factors such as asthma and obesity. Garner, who was much larger than the officers, resisted arrest, at which time a chokehold was used, causing his death. The next incident was the incident of Michael Brown on August 9, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. Brown was shoplifting when the police came and attempted to stop him. Brown attacked the police officer through the open window of the police car, attempting to disarm the police officer, at which time he was shot the first time. When the officer exited the vehicle, Brown, who was much larger and had already almost disarmed the officer, charged at him, at which time he was shot the second time, killing him. This shooting was ruled self-defense, and the officer was not charged, causing outrage in the community and violent riots throughout the country. The next death was the death of Freddie Gray, April 12, 2015 in Baltimore, Maryland. Mr. Gray was arrested carrying a concealed knife. He was handcuffed and shackled, after which he was placed in a police wagon for transport. In an unknown manner, inside the police wagon prisoner compartment, Gray sustained a severed spinal cord, causing his death. In this case, the DA rushed to judgment and overcharged the officers with crimes that were impossible for her to prove. Due to this, the charges were dismissed, and the officers were not recharged. This resulted in violent riots throughout Baltimore and in other cities in America. It is true that African Americans are disproportionately killed by police officers nationwide. More Caucasians are shot and killed by the police. However, due to the fact that African Americans make up 13% of the population, this accounts for the disparity. Now we'll move on to a description of the Black Lives Matter movement. In July 2015, a coalition of community groups gathered at Cleveland State University to form an umbrella organization that could not be ignored. The Black Lives Matter manifesto was written at this time, and they began the Black Lives Matter hashtag. According to others, Black Lives Matter hashtag and the movement was organized by 3 activists, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, as a social media outcry. Black Lives Matter has now grown to over 30 chapters. Black Lives Matter has engaged in protests, some of which have turned into violent riots. Black Lives Matter was able to disrupt the campaign events of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016. There is an opposing viewpoint and a plethora of data that tends to invalidate the Black Lives Matter message. There are many studies that prove that officers hesitate or take longer to shoot suspects that are white or Hispanic than suspects that are black. The Black Lives Matter movement does not disclose the fact that the vast majority of people killed by the police are armed with a dangerous weapon at the time of their fatal encounter, and more than 2/3 are in possession of a firearm. One study showed police officers in Houston were nearly 24% less likely to shoot blacks than whites. There are many more studies I could cite, but it would take us outside the scope of this presentation. We now move to the social psychological analysis of Black Lives Matter, the theories, concepts, research, and cognitive relationship. This has all resulted from violence and aggression. There are many theories that account for violence and aggression, but 3 famous theories are the social learning theory. This indicates violence and aggression is learned through observational learning. The frustration aggression theory indicates violence occurs when a goal or need is blocked. The psychoanalytic theory indicates that aggression and violence occur when the pleasure-seeking id is unmitigated by the superego and the ego. More Black Lives Matter concepts. One major concept to Black Lives Matter is implicit and explicit bias. Black Lives Matter has indicated that violence against black citizens is a result of implicit and explicit bias. The American Psychological Association Dictionary indicates that implicit bias is a relatively enduring and general evaluative response of which a person has little or no conscious awareness. The American Psychological Association Dictionary defines explicit bias as a relatively enduring and general evaluative response which a person is consciously aware of. Now we're going to go into the cognitive antecedents of aggression. Research indicates regarding general predictors of aggression, there is a large degree of uncertainty still. Antecedents of aggression cannot be captured by a single theory. Studies show that impaired cognition appears to be a large factor in the aggression puzzle. Studies show that aggressive individuals have a multitude of cognitive deficits. Studies have also shown that aggressive behavior can substantially be attributed to damaged frontal lobes and impaired executive functioning. Aggressive individuals have been shown to have impulsivity, poor planning ability, working memory deficits, and low verbal intelligence. Lastly, we cannot discount environmental factors such as the social learning theory that was previously mentioned as a factor in aggression. One of the most important studies specifically done on Black Lives Matter is a study by SAWYER and GAMPA. The study done in 2018 showed after controlling for changes in participant demographics, overall implicit attitudes were less pro-white during Black Lives Matter periods than the pre-Black Lives Matter periods. And it became increasingly less pro-white across the Black Lives Matter period and less pro-white during most periods of high Black Lives Matter struggle. The results further showed, considering changes in implicit attitudes by participants, whites became implicitly less pro-white during the Black Lives Matter periods where blacks showed little change. Further, regarding explicit attitudes, the study showed that whites became less pro-white and blacks became less pro-black during the Black Lives Matter period, each moving toward egalitarian, no-preference position. What are some solutions to this terrible problem? Well, the Black Lives Matter movement is an anti-racist social movement. Anti-racist social movements offer a potential societal level alternative for reducing racial bias. There are several attitude change theories that can explain why social movements have the potential to drive societal level changes in both implicit and explicit attitudes. President Trump's recent executive order for law enforcement reform is a positive step in the right direction. It requires all agencies to gain accreditation by credentialing authorities. These will provide new standards and uniform standards. The Justice Department is going to begin a new database to trace firings, decertifications, criminal charges and civil charges against officers, and complaints regarding excessive force. Studies have shown the Black Lives Matter movement is working, but it is imperative that further protests are free of violence, riots, mayhem that has occurred so far. I also believe that improvements need to be made in the hiring of police officers. Not all police agencies use a polygraph exam to weed out people who have things in their background that disqualify them. Not all police agencies require psychological exams, and this needs to be uniform. Conclusion. During the George Floyd protest and riots, 19 people were murdered. In all of 2019, 14 unarmed people were shot and killed by the police. That's 14 too many, but how are we going to make the problem better if these riots and violence are killing more people than the police are? The Black Lives Matter movement in theory and concept has been very positive. It has brought awareness. The Black Lives Matter movement has caused real change in attitudes and implicit and explicit racial attitudes. We don't know how much more effective it would have been in producing change without the riots, arsons, murder, and mayhem. There is a major difference between peaceful protests and the riots that were seen in many cities. Innocent people were murdered, maimed, and innocent people's property was destroyed. It is unknown how much more effective Black Lives Matter movement would have been without this violence. Future studies should focus on what effects the Black Lives Matter movement has if and when the violence is removed. These next slides are the references that were used in this presentation. And this is the end of the Black Lives Matter movement presentation by Matthew Quist. Thank you very much for your time and attention.